Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard me mention this name on this program often. We're pleased to be joined by John Guy. We kind of pride ourselves here in talking about football journeys. You're hard pressed to find someone who's had a more rich football journey than John. D1 coach at, among other places, UNC, Alabama, NFL coach for the Raiders and Steelers, including a Coach of the Year finalist, scout for the Cleveland Browns, and how I know him, he was vice president of player personnel for the Bills for 10 years, where I worked with him. Currently an agent at Vanguard, representing a prominent Buffalo Bills player. And John, thanks for joining us. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Bradenton, Florida.
Nice.
We're jealous. There's snow here on the ground.
Remember that?
Let me give you one correction there. I'm not an agent.
Not an agent. Okay, you're with an agency.
No, I consult an agency.
Consult an agency. Very good. Okay,
Right.
I'll take the clarification. That's
okay.
important.
I take all titles.
Is agent a dirty 5-letter word?
No, but there's some places you can go and some places you can't go. You know, it's like you look at the pro workouts right now, the college days that everybody's having right now, starting up probably this week. A lot of colleges won't allow agents in because agents sometimes try to influence the underclassmen and that kind of thing. And there's probably years ago it was probably that way, but probably not as much now. But you know, some places I can go and be me, and the other places, you know, if you're an agent, you know, I always have to clarify that I'm not an agent. I'm a consultant.
Consultant for an agent. And where you do go into those places, you always make a friend. I've noticed that at the airport, at the shoe shine, you make friends. It's how you roll. What a football journey you have. Like I said, Josh and I, we'd like to get into this with the guests that we've had, but maybe you could just kind of tell us, you know, go dial it all the way back to how you got into football from, you know, a player and into college. And
so in the 9th grade, I tell everybody I played every position. I played every position on the team except in the game. I never played. So I've been very fortunate to have good, for really a high percentage of the people that have been in my life have been positive influence. I shagged the balls if there was a bad pass or whether it was football or baseball, I always went to get the loose ball. But there's this guy in my neighborhood. His name was Curly Neal.
What?
Curly Neal of the Harlem Globetrotters. He told me when I got my first pair of Converse, he says, Chucks will not make you great. They will not make you jump high. They will not make you run fast. It's the work that you have to do in them. So I've always had people that were, factors, maybe a little tidbit here or there that I kind of did the math, and even to this day I still keep a diary. But to make a long story short, I played in North Carolina A&T, which is like 2 miles from my house. There's some advantages of playing at home, staying at home. I was trying to weigh my options. I was home. My college coach called me and says, hey, you know, there's a coach down at North Carolina looking for coaches. At that time, there were not very many African-American coaches. He said, well, he's trying to get a coach. So he said, why don't you get your best suit ready and we'll go down and interview. So he set the whole thing up. And here's a lesson.
That was before the shopping channel too. So
this was way before the shopping channel.
We'll get into that later. Yeah, go ahead.
I got to tell you the story. So the day that they were telling you how to dress for an interview and how to manage an interview, I was not there. Or the week, the month, whichever, I was not there. So I go on this job interview. I'm like just 20 years old. I dress up. Well, first of all, I have this huge afro. Huge. If you ever seen a picture of Angela Davis, that was my afro. So it was huge. I had a pair of wireframe glasses on. I had a double knit brown orange suit on with a pair of platform shoes on with a butterfly on the toe. So I go down there for the interview. So I go in, I walk in, and the head coach was Bill Dooley. He looked at me here's one of the lessons. He says, "Boy, you're a dapper dresser," and I'm trying to figure out what does dapper mean. But I nailed the job. I got the job interview.
That's awesome.
I got the job.
There wouldn't happen to be a picture of you that day, would there? Kicking
in my
around
mind,
somewhere. Okay, in your mind, you described it well.
But so that's how I got into coaching. I went there, and it was late in July, and I wanted to get into. They had a new department there called City and Regional Planning. I couldn't get in that department, so I got into education, and so I stayed there in that position as graduate assistant. I was RA and all that, and the dorm, and this was a life's lesson for me because all my education was predominantly black. I never was in an integrated situation from first all the way through college. I never was. That's why that dapper word I had to figure out. I learned quickly that words have 3 meanings, not 2. So I had to figure out what dapper meant. But so I was there, and in less than a year, they promoted me to a full-time coach. First year salary was $11,780.
Right to the dollar you have it. You remember that?
Oh, I did more with that money than I do today.
That's
I'm just telling you. But that's how I got into coaching.
So maybe you can walk us through your college coaching career, before we get into your things with the NFL. What did you enjoy about coaching in college, and maybe what did you learn that then translated, into your pro career as a coach and then as a front office executive?
There are a lot of lessons that I learned, and a lot of things. I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned was being just developing and understanding what empathy was all about. Everybody comes to college with their own mindset and their own bag of tools and their own amount of energy, and it's being able to kind of weed out what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's not true, what's fair, what's not fair. Sitting down, listening. I'm 21 years old, and we had players there that were older than me. At that time, they were guys that had medical, they were red shirts, they had freshman ineligible rule, so there were guys there that was, 23, 24 years old, and I'm, 20, 21. So being able to listen and being an RA in the dorm and coming from a sociology, psychology background, just being able to put all that together and just try to be one that, to try to meet people where they are. If they meet you halfway, you got a chance. And just that was what college was like. It was college coaching was about learning, developing, because I had limited knowledge of football anyway, coming from my background and what we played, and just being in an integrated situation and putting all that together, not to mention having to learn how to socialize on a professional level, coming from college and going right in there. You're at the number one university in the state, and you're always meeting people, you're always greeting, and you have to go out and recruit. It was just a total. I like to say I grew up in Chapel Hill. I grew up as a person and as a man in Chapel Hill, but I'm originally from Greensboro. So that I heard
you talk about Chapel Hill a lot. You referred to that a lot in our conversations. I could tell it's where a couple things you mentioned there. About how you got your start playing by shagging fly balls. That's how Mariano Rivera got into baseball in Panama. So he turned out to be pretty much a master of his craft. And then I would say, when you were vice president of player personnel at the Bills, and I went randomly around the office and said, "I want you to describe someone in this office who looks dapper," it would have been you every time. Dapper in a good way. I don't know any other way to describe dapper other than a good way. Obviously, it worked for you.
But just to go back to that experience, shagging balls. We had Curly Neal, the Harlem Globetrotters, my neighborhood.
Okay, how did you meet him again? That's amazing. How did you meet Curly Neal again? Through Converse?
In my neighborhood. He grew up in my neighborhood. We went to the same high school. Our whole deal. Wow. Charlie Sanders, Detroit Lions Hall of Famer, my neighborhood. Shag balls for those guys. Lou Hudson, all-time leading scorer for Atlanta Hawks. There were tons of guys, and the sad thing about all this is that, what I did take from that experience was there was tons of talent, but not all the talent could get into the colleges. I mean, the scores weren't good, or character issues or whatever. But just listening to guys. This is where this guy screwed up, and this is what helped this guy. Who the college recruiters were. I mean, it was like I was getting this before I was ready for it, before I even heard it. Before ever a coach ever told me. Just from these guys. It was just interesting.
So you go North Carolina, you end up at Alabama. And then, were your eyes always set on getting to the NFL? Did you think you would be a college lifer? Like where did you, decide to take the bigger promotion and, the bigger time job? And like, what was your ultimate goal as you, as your career went on?
And who was the head coach at Alabama when you were there?
Bill Curry.
Okay. Yeah.
I had been, here's what happened. It's really, I was trying to do, the only thing I tried to do was you have to understand the time period. During that time, this was in the 70s, and African Americans were trying to rid themselves of old perceptions and images and so forth. So it's all about trying to get it right. So I tried to listen and understand, and it was really interesting at North Carolina. It's a Southern school, and I'm a local boy, and just trying to learn how to just integrate and be social. I went to Carolina. I mean, my whole set was to go to graduate school and work on a master's PhD. That was my whole plan. The day I got the phone call about the interview, I was packing cold weather clothes because I wasn't sure where I was going. So I didn't get into coaching as a, path to sports. I got into it because it was like I really didn't know. I developed that saying: any road will take you anywhere, as long as you're not speeding fast on it. If you take the wrong road, you don't need to speed. But so I never. So the longer I stayed in at Carolina, the more I wanted to be athletic director. I wanted to be an athletic director because you got to look and see at what images I saw before me, and there were not any athletic directors that were African American. Very few coaches. So from North Carolina, I went to Virginia Tech. Big lesson. I go to Virginia Tech on January the 8th, 1978, and I left on March the 14th, 1978. I did not stay there long enough because of principle. I was developing principle. I went there for a fixed salary. Okay. When I got there, I was given what was promised. Duke University, which was like 13 miles from my address in Chapel Hill, Mike McGee offered me a job interview. So I go down and I come back, and I, and the head coach, I've been with him. I like Mike McGee, and I like that staff, and I like the staff at North Carolina. But the staff was splitting up, dividing, and half went to Virginia Tech and half went. But the story was, I was given a fixed salary. So when I went to North Carolina, when I went to Duke, they offered me a higher salary. When I came back to Virginia Tech from that visit to Duke, the head coach says, "Hey, I'm going to give you X number of dollars." And I looked at the coach and I said, "Why didn't you give me this in the beginning?" It was just a principle. And he had no answer. But I said, "I'm going to do." That was it. I mean, if you wanted me, you had me, you could have given me, but I never coached for money. I never took a job for money. Never. I've left them for money, but not for money. So that was a learning lesson for me. Know your value, be appreciated, and I felt like I was underappreciated, so I left. So then I went to Duke, enjoyed Duke University. Duke was a different place in Chapel Hill. Was a little smaller group of people, a little bit more independent. You didn't have to manage the players as much as you had at Carolina. Most of the students at Duke athletes came from all over. North Carolina, 50%, 49% came from the state. So, it's a little different. And but I like Duke. I like the experience of Duke. And one of my
yeah,
I got to tell you this. One of my punishments from going to Duke was when I went to Duke, they gave me a Ford something. I don't know what it was. But it had a Blue Devil on the hood of the car and on the doors. But I lived in Chapel Hill, so I had to drive through Chapel Hill with that Blue Devil on my car.
Who do you cheer for now when they play?
I don't cheer for anybody.
No.
So,
my loyalty is who's paying me.
There you go. That's
wondering.
So I kind of like. I mean, I'm not a. There are coaches I like more than others. I don't really get into that. I just watch the game for what it's what the game's all about. Just the purity of the game. I mean, I don't really.
I wondered if that rivalry had started yet. You pretty much answered that by saying that the Blue Devil was a problem driving that car around in Chapel Hill. That answers it for sure. And then
they test my loyalty
for sure.
So you go to Alabama from there, and then
I went from Duke to Georgia Tech.
Okay,
I told you there was a page 2, John.
Yeah. No, you covered the Southeast. So maybe so then. Were your sights set on the NFL at any point there? Was that a pipe dream? Was that something you didn't even think about? How did that come around?
It started to change. Moving to Atlanta altered my whole career, altered my life. And I like to tell the story that I committed social suicide in Atlanta. I did.
Do tell.
I had to balance that up a little bit. But you had pro sports in Atlanta. We could go over to the Falcons. The Falcons were in the old stadium, and we were welcome over there. And and so I got into that. And so it took me 10 years. Listen, 10 years to get an intern in the National Football League. To get an internship in the National Football League took me 10 years. Now, Dan Rooney sent me a letter. And I got all those letters saved from, all those rejection letters. And Dan Rooney said to me, hey, he says, your resume is good as some of our coaches, and you want an internship? And I go, hey, well. So he said, well, I'm going to recommend you to my close friend, who really was a relative, with the New York Giants. All right? He hand wrote this note on the rejection letter, kind of. And so I started thinking, but it took me 10 years. And right about the end of my year at Georgia Tech, I really got into pro football. So the Pittsburgh Steelers gave me an internship. And the first year, they give you, every year you get an internship, they give you X number of dollars for the time you were there. So the first year I didn't know that. So I took the money.
What year was that?
This was 1978 or 9, somewhere in there.
My gosh!
So it was like
great,
so it took me a long time. It started, but for 2 years I had in 2 more years I had internships at the Steelers, and I never took the money. I spent my summers in training camp with the Steelers, and it really got started at Duke. The initial NFL deal, because our staff went and visited the Steelers doing training camp. That's when they had the steel curtain and all those guys. I mean, that was like, oh man, it was like the lure of it all. I saw it up in Latrobe, and so I go like, yeah, this is what I like to do. And so fortunately, there were guys on the staff. I got a chance to get to know Chuck Noll. Chuck Noll is the one that got me into drinking wine. And here's that story. Chuck Noll, at the end of training camp, used to have what they call the 5 o'clock club, where the reporters come in after practice, and Chuck would come in, and Chuck was a great guy, and he was. The guy was solid all the way through. He did interviews, he did all that, but he really wanted to have a glass of wine and a piece of cheese. And so he would pull me over in the meetings, in the press room.
In the room with Chuck Noll, there's wine flowing and cheese.
Who would have
Well,
thought the head
not
coach
really
of the
flowing,
Steelers,
but,
the Steel Curtain,
you know,
was a wine and cheese guy?
He was a wine and cheese guy. He flew his own plane. He had his own boat, you know. So I got to know Chuck pretty good. And here's what I took from that internship. Create value. Learning to create value as you go through life. So I'm in there, and I'm an intern. And so I'm the only one. I got taught. Our meetings were held in an old theater on Latrobe, right on the St. Vincent campus. So I learned how to control the lights because there was a stage in there and they had all kinds of floodlights. I learned to control the lights. So for 3 years in training camp, I turned the lights off and on. So when I left, when I became a full-time coach with the Steelers, it was a brand new staff. And in our first meeting there, we had a day up there. We went and checked out the training camp facilities. I was the only one that knew how to turn the lights off and on. So
That's value, yeah.
For
Can't
6
meet in the
years,
dark.
I was the only one that turned the lights off and on in training camp. But that's how I got to the Steelers.
Chuck Noll, wine and cheese. That surprises me. So then, what's your revelation about Al Davis that we don't know?
Al Davis, you know, I have to say this now. I'm not bragging, but it's a fact. I worked for Dan Rooney, Hall of Fame owner, whatever. Mm-hmm. I worked for Al Davis, Hall of Famer, coach, owner, manager, whatever that is. I worked for Ralph Wilson. Okay. Hall of Famer. Worked with Marv Levy. I worked with Joe Green. All these guys were in the NFL Hall of Fame. You know, Dick LeBeau. Just all of famers. And everybody has their own story. You know. What
do they? Maybe this is overly simplistic, but what do they all have in common? If there is something you could point to about what made them great, other than, I mean, I don't know, talent as a player, obviously, but being an owner I would think it's how you treat people. I'm guessing you would say it's something like that, but
you know, I say this, and I started this a long time ago. When I was at Georgia Tech, Bill Curry told me that, he says, one of the mark of growing up and being a professional is having your own stationery. And even to this day, Don Purdy, you still get a Christmas card from me, right?
Yeah, I do. In fact, John, I was talking to, I'm going to get together with some former Bills members in a couple weeks at the Ridge. Mark Conan owns the restaurant. And I was on a group text message, and I told them I was going to have you on. And somebody immediately said, "Oh my gosh, I always remember he always gave us gifts at Christmas time." Like it was just one of your signature things. It was just, and they said it. I could look at the text, but it's just something they immediately remembered about you.
Well, that was, so I sent out these Christmas cards. And until Dan Rooney died, I got a Christmas card from Dan Rooney's family every year. I get a Christmas card from Mike Brown and his family every year, but they're on my Christmas card list. But you asked me about Al Davis. Al Davis was the most knowledgeable. There are only two really owners I felt like that knew football that you could have a technical conversation with, and that would be John Richardson with the Panthers and Al Davis. I liked Al Davis. It was a great experience for me to be with him, and and he was a different guy, man. I mean, like the first time I met him, and I go like, "Thank you, I'm happy to be here." He looked at me. He says, "Well, everybody wants to be a Raider." He says, "Just do your job, just do your job." That's and but I was kind of like his whipping guy. Most people, he worked out every day in the weight room in the afternoon, which I never left the weight room when he was in there, but really nobody was ever in there because it was late, and especially in the off season. And he would have conversations with me, and he'd ask me stuff, and but he already had the answer. If he asked you a question, he already had the answer. He asked me one time to take. He kept telling me, he says, "I need you to look at these two guys," and he says, "But my guy, I want you to look at my guy and see how this other guy compares to my guy." And so I'm like, "Well, who's your guy?" He says, "You know, that chief guy." I said, "Neil Smith?" He says, "No, Derek Thomas." I go like, "Okay." I says, I okay. So I go and I can't find the film. I cannot find the film. I go to Video Guys, no film. I told him I need this film because Al gave me a project.
Yeah.
Well, Al had the only copy, he thought. But he asked me to look at it, and I was supposed to come in next morning to talk to him about what I saw. Well, he had the only copy. Now, how was I going to evaluate that? And he had the only copy, right?
Yeah.
But some kind of way, the Otten boys pulled it together. I got the video, and I walked in. He goes like, "How'd you evaluate those guys?" And I told him. He said, "Well, where'd you get the film?" I said, I dug it out. The guys in the video room did it. But he always had the answer. We were in a meeting room. He says to me one time, he says, "John, how many times was Chester McLaughlin on the ground?" And I hadn't counted him. I didn't, it's like Joe Bugle was the head coach there once. And Joe called our meetings barbecues, not meetings, but barbecues. Because you're gonna get roasted when you go in there. So, and I go like, "Coach, I'm trying to coach him to keep him off the ground." He says, "Okay." He was on the ground 9 times. So I said, "Okay, that's something else I got to start doing. Counting the number of times they're on the ground." But he always had all the answers. I really enjoyed Al Davis the times I was around him because he was always frustrated at somebody or frustrated with me. And he gave me that term. He told me, he asked me that I had coached Pat Swilling at Georgia Tech, and Pat was in his last trip in the pros, and he said, "Did you call Pat?" I go like, "This in the weight room." He asked me, had I called Swilling? I go like, "No." I says, "He can call me. I know him. I recruited him out of high school. I coached him 4 years. He can call me. He can have a conversation with me if he needs to." He says, "No, you need to have a conversation with him." I go like, "Oh, okay." And he looked at me and he goes like, "Do I have to give you an apple and a roadmap?" He did. He says, "Yeah, apple and a roadmap." I go like, "Well, yeah, I think so, because I'm not sure what I needed to talk to him about." He says, "Well, it's free agency, and like, I was not. It was just different things." He asked me one time in the ball game. He goes like, "Pregame," because I like to be on the sideline and in the pregame. And if you ever noticed, you watched the Raiders when Al was the head coach. It's the last play before the team went to the locker room, in pregame warm up. Okay, he always threw a deep 9 route down the boundary, right where the visiting team were warming up. Always
Sending a message.
sending a message. So I was out there standing. He says, "You know that official right there?" I go like, "No." He says, "You don't know him?" I said, "No." He says, "Don't you get a list every week that report on the officials?" I go like, "No, sir, I don't get that report." He says, "You don't?" I go like, "No, sir, I don't get it. I don't know him." So he said, "Go over there and introduce yourself to him." So I go over there and I introduce myself, and I come back. He says, "Well, here's his name. This is his name. He went to Jackson State, this, that, and the other. You should know him." So this is a lesson. So when I came to Buffalo, one of the things that we had to do in the pro department was to do advanced scouting for the team. So in our packet that the coaches got was a description and a picture of the official on a cutout laminated little card that they could carry to the game on sideline so that they would know.
That's funny that you mentioned that when I was on the sideline just before you got there. Carl Malk was our official scout for the officials, and he got to know all the officials' wives' names, kids' names. He knew a lot about and he had been in the NFL forever. And he was a little more colorful, I'm assuming, than some of the other guys when it came to, "Hey, how you doing? How's your wife?" Whatever. It was all friendly and cordial at the beginning of the game. But then by about the second quarter, sometimes he would, invoke a side judge's wife's name about how terrible his performance was that day or whatever. So like getting to know the officials, and then he pissed some of them off. I mean, he was colorful in his critique of the officials and their families and what their families would think of their job performance that day. So that's real funny. So when you get to Buffalo, what did you feel coming here? Obviously that was kind of a direction, like a career change for you to, go into the front office. Like how did that come about? And what were your thoughts like when you first got here?
Well, there was a transitional period. That was the Cleveland Browns. I left the Raiders. Our staff was fired like Christmas Eve at the Raiders. And, well, I don't think Al celebrated Christmas.
That's right.
No, I think Al celebrated Hanukkah, I believe.
Yeah, right.
So the Raiders had moved up to Oakland at that time. So I moved back down to L.A. And so I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I was approached by Jerry Jones at the Combine that year, and he said, "Give me a call," and I gave him a call, and I gave him a call, and I gave him a call, and I gave him a call. Then I got his secretary call, and she said, "Well, he's getting my messages. He's getting my messages from you." So I go like, "That ain't gonna happen." So I call Mr. Davis, and so I go like, "Mr. Davis," he says, "Where are you?" And I says, "Well, I'm in L.A." He says, "Why are you in L.A.?" I said, "Well, I was terminated there." And he goes like, "Well, you can't go to LA." I go like, "Well, I don't have a job with you." He says, your contract's up to 31st, whatever it was, of the month. And I go like, "Well, you got a new staff in there now." And he says, "Well," so this is what Al said to me. Listen, I mean, this is as cold as it can be. He says, "I'm going to talk to Jerry in a day or so. If he mentions your name, I will recommend you." What he said. And that really ticked me off. So I said, "You know what? I'm going to stay in LA, and this is a cruel business." And so I moved down to LA, and I was there from, March to July, and I was trying to get a job. I woke up one morning, my buddy had lived over in Westwood, and right behind the Rupert Murdoch building, I just opened the French doors and took a breath of fresh air, could smell the ocean air. And I said, "I'm going to change professions." So I said, "Okay." So anyway, so I called, made a couple of phone calls, and ultimately my recommendation was handed to George Young in the league office. And George hired me with the Cleveland Browns. So he hired me as a college scout. So that was the transition from coaching to scouting to front office with the Buffalo Bills.